Hello everyone. In this lab I'm going to show you how to export an animation from Maya into a video format. We're going to use Adobe Premiere to export our image sequence that we're going to create here soon. And we're going to go ahead and do that using the bouncing ball. I'm also going to show you a couple extra things regarding the Arnold renderer, and we're going to use the Arnold renderer and let's just dive in. So going into it, I'm going to go to Arnold, and then I'm going to create a light. And in this case, I'm going to use the physical sky. Lights, physical sky. You'll see here, there's our skylight. It doesn't seem much like a light because it's totally dark. Even if you press 7 on your keyboard, it doesn't register it as a light. But we're going to go ahead and use that physical sky for this. Now, the first thing I want to do is, once I create that, I want to test my render. I want to see what it looks like. And you're going to notice that I have this black space in between. What that is I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to press 4 on my keyboard. Is the empty space it's displaying between the actual world and the polyplane. So I'm going to press R to scale this and use my middle mouse button, click, and I'm going to scale it so that it's just outside of my world here. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to zoom back in on my bouncing ball, and I just want to double check. I'm going to press 5, 6 on my keyboard that it's playing. Okay. So another thing we can do, I'm going to create a camera, and I'm also going to change this viewport to my camera viewport. Okay. Now, another thing I want to do while I'm at this is shading, or view, excuse me, camera settings, and resolution gate. So I'm going to go ahead and go into, I don't want this 640 by 480. I want to change it to a widescreen resolution. I'm going to go to my render. My rendering tab is located over here. By default, it's on modeling. I'm going to click on it. I'm going to go down to rendering, and then under render, I'm going to go to render settings. Now from here, I'm going to make sure this is on the Arnold renderer, and then I'm also going to go ahead and change some of these settings in here to get us ready for exporting animation. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to change my format, my image format, to a JPEG. Another thing I'm going to do is under frame animation extension. This is set up for a single frame, so rendering out an entire animation sequence will not work. So I'm going to go ahead and click on here, and I'm going to do name number dot extension, and then you'll see that this opens up. If it's on that single frame one, this is all grayed out. You can't select anything. If we do name number dot extension, that extension will be JPEG in this case. If I had it set as PNG or anything else, that would be the extension for that. But in this case, we're going to use JPEG. Just a really simple image file format. So name number dot extension. Now my start frame is going to be frame 1, and my end frame is going to be frame 24. End frame 24. We're going to keep it by frame at 1 frame, so every frame it renders will be 1 frame. And then I'm going to go ahead, scrub down, and I'm going to do under renderable camera, I'm going to switch this to camera 1. And then I'll leave the rest the same, except I'm going to change my size here, and I'm going to change it to, instead of preset 640 by 480, I'm going to keep it at a smaller size, but I'm going to do HD 540, so it's 16 by 9 aspect ratio, and I'm going to go ahead and hit close now. And you'll see I have a better, with my viewport settings as they are, I'll be able to see much more clearly what will be on screen while rendering. Okay. Now I'm gonna actually have this ball start off screen and then okay, so this is gonna be my camera here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna lock these settings on my camera 1. Make sure your camera 1 is selected, and then I'm gonna lock these settings because I don't want it to change. Now from this point, we should be pretty well set up for rendering. We can run a quick test before. It's always good to run a quick test. And you'll see again that that black space, because we enlarged and scaled the entire polyplane larger, that it's not there. You'll see we have a shadow casted on the ground from the actual ball, and we have a default sky here along our ground plane, and you'll see these little boxes just doing their own rendering thing. It's basically what it's doing when it's doing that is it's calculating the light and how the light bounces off of the ground plane and how it affects any other object in the scene, because reflectivity and light bounces, it simulates sort of a realistic lighting setting, a realistic light as best as it possibly can with light bouncing and so on and so forth. But as I had mentioned in a previous lab, that it's not exactly the same as a real life lighting scheme here. So anyway, I'm pleased with the way the render came out, and I'm going to go ahead and I want to run a batch render now, because I've gone through my render settings one more time. I'm just going to show you. If I go to my render settings, I've set this to JPEG up here. I've set name number.extension, start frame 1, end frame 24 by 1 frame at a time. So it's just going to render frame 1, frame 2. If you set it to like 0.5, it would frame 1, frame 1.5, frame 2, so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and hit close. And from here, another thing I want to do is I want to set my project. So if I do File, Set Project, I'm going to do my bouncing ball, and I'm going to go ahead and hit set. Now, what that does is it creates a file path directly from the software into that folder. So now it'll know where to save out all of these images to. It actually creates a default folder called images. It'll also create other default folders as you work on the file more. But at this point, I'm going to go ahead and do a file, save scene as. Remember, we have to change this to Maya ASC2, and go ahead, bouncing ball render.ma, and I'm going to hit save. And then I'm going to hit continue. And now, I'm going to run one more test. Yeah, okay. I'm going to press escape. Escape cancels a still frame render. And then I'm going to go ahead and do a render and batch render. And I'm going to hit continue. Now, while that starts rendering, you'll see it says rendering with Arnold Render. If you click here in the bottom right corner, this is your script editor. Scrub down, it's rendering. Once it starts to render, it should show you a percentage. It'll show you in a second here once it begins. And another thing I want to do, if you haven't done it already, is go ahead and open up Premiere. Just go ahead and do new project, and then browse. And I'm just setting this to be my bouncing ball, and I'm going to hit select folder. So I set my location just as we sort of did by setting project with our file set project. That's basically what we're doing here in Adobe Premiere. Now the other thing is name your file. bouncing ball, and then everything else should be the same, and press OK. Give that a moment. So I'm going to let that do its thing for now. And I'm going to show you that it's rendering. There we go. Adobe Premiere is now opened. Well, it's still opening. I'm going to try to switch back to Maya. You'll see down here, percent rendering 24%, and it'll just keep working its way through this file. It's on render 3, 4. Okay. And you'll see this render. So this should take, I don't know. I have a lot on my computer right now. I was opening up Adobe Premiere. I'm rendering images. Rendering takes up a lot of memory in your computer, so you don't want to be doing too much while that's happening. I'm also running Maya 3D software, as well as a screen capture software, which really eats the RAM on my computer. So this takes a little bit longer while I have all these applications open. I even do have Photoshop open and internet browser, to give you an idea, but it will bog down your entire system as it's rendering. I just had a, I don't know if I can drag it over, but my virus software just came up with a warning: high CPU usage by Maya batch. So it is using a lot of my CPU power. And yeah, so we're at render image 8. Image 9. So as this is rendering, let me go ahead and show you something. If I can. Just a moment. So we're halfway through the render. And just another minute. It's just taking a very long time as it's rendering. I'm going to drag all this over. It's going to take a minute. And you'll see that in my modeling bouncing ball, by default, because I set my project, created an images folder. From this folder, it creates, this is where it saves the rendered images to. So it looks like it's working on render 16 now. It means we have 8 frames. And then I'm going to show you how to import these images into Adobe Premiere. And then we're going to export it one more time as an image sequence in just a moment here. So once you have Adobe Premiere open, I'm going to show you where to import these images from. Obviously, I won't be able to do it until it's all finished rendering. When it's all finished rendering, it will typically notify you somehow with like maybe a little sound effect or something. If not, just double check to make sure. And from here we can do File, because we're going to import our image sequence. Import. Okay. So now I'm going to go to my images, because I set my project to this particular folder when I first opened up Premiere. I'm going to double click my images folder. And it's rendering the final image, and now it's completed. So now that my render is complete, I can go ahead and click my very first one, bouncing ball render 1, and then all the way through and all the way to 24. And what I need to do is click the very first one and then do image sequence. From here I'm going to click open. It's importing my file. Okay, and then under project in my bottom left hand corner it says project bouncing ball. There is an Arnold watermark on it, you'll see. I don't know exactly. I've heard there's ways to get rid of the Arnold watermark. I'm not particularly familiar with it on how to do it. It has something to do with, there's a way to, I've heard, to do it by rendering out what is it, animation sequence or something like that. But we don't need to worry about that at the moment. We're going to go ahead and click and drag this. It has to do with licensing. Okay. And I'm going to leave the Arnold watermark on there. It will not render out still frame images with that watermark on, but it will render out an animation sequence in a batch render. Now I'm going to go ahead and press play. You'll notice it's playing rather quickly. One of the first things I can do to make sure is when I'm going to right click on here, I'm going to do not speed duration, modify. I'm going to right click on my bouncing ball, modify, interpret footage, it says use frame rate from file 29.9700. That's the frame rate for film. We're gonna assume this frame rate, and we're gonna do 24 frames per second, FPS. 24 frames per second. And then I'm gonna go ahead and click OK. So it should slow it down a little bit. I'm gonna run another click and drag and bring it over here. Change sequence. It says this clip does not match the current sequence settings because it was at almost 29.97 frames per second, and we're just changing it to 24 frames per second. And I'm going to hit change sequence settings, and now I'm going to run a play one more time, and it seems to run a little bit more smoothly because by default Maya should be at 24 frames per second, so it has a little bit more realistic of a bounce. Now that I've got my bouncing ball here bouncing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do File, Export, Media, and then from here I'm going to click on Output Name, and I'm going to name it Bouncing Ball Render. That's fine. Bouncing Ball Render. Save. Another thing I'm going to do is under Format, I'm going to change this to H.264. And that's going to save it out as an MP4. So Format, H.264 is a compression setting, and that's really all it is. It just keeps it as a smaller file size. So it's one of the best compressions that I know of anyway in Premiere to save file size and upload time on your files. If you don't have this set to H.264, it's going to take you longer to upload your files. So from here, H.264, not worried about the Arnold watermark, and then I'm going to go ahead, and you can mess around with these settings. I'm not going to. It really using maximum render quality really increases render time, and in this case we don't need it that badly. So from here, what I'm going to do, I've located where I want to save it to. It's in my bouncing ball. I'm going to click Save, and then I'm going to press Export. Okay, so apparently it's all finished, and I'm going to go to my bouncing ball, and I should have an MP4 file. I'm going to right click and open with QuickTime. QuickTime's a free download software that you can get from Apple website. You can Google it, QuickTime. Your standard default video player should be able to play it regardless. And now I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And there's our... One thing I do like about it, about QuickTime in particular, is that it can scrub through frame by frame using just the arrow keys. So play it. There we go. There's our bouncing ball. You can do this running the Maya software, but I wanted to go ahead and show you a couple extra things in Arnold. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful for you. Be sure to upload a MP4 file or whatever movie file format works best for you. But the H.264 compression is going to be your smaller file size and decrease your upload time on your submissions. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. And there's exporting a animation in Maya using the Arnold renderer.